All right, Mikhail, we're really glad to have you today to share your insights with Sparklehood. So we have Mikhil Innani here. He's managing and director and CEO at Apollo Finvest, which is a publicly listed NBFC. And the core idea is it's AWS for lending. And Mikhil being a hardcore product guy, I think he keeps jumping from one very diverse field to another field. And in his past, I think, roles in Avatar, he has built products which have been scaled from almost scratch to 300 plus million monthly active users, which is quite an amazing feat. Any founder worth his salt would know that.
Mhm.
And we're also super happy that Mikhail has actually very kindly agreed to be a mentor on Sparklehood board. Um, so, Mikhail, so the first question to you is you have had a very long 9 year sort of career, which seems very well balanced between corporate and startup world, right? It's kind of doesn't happen, and it was kind of like on and off, like that way. So, any sort of experiences which helped you from your corporate life in the startup world, and vice versa, startup experiences which helped the other way around?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think, like you mentioned, I was very fortunate basically to have a diverse, background in terms of the last, pure decade, I would say, in the digital space in India, basically, right? So I think almost every experience that I had, like, ended up teaching me something or the other, which, held me in good stead for my next adventure, right? So I would say, as an example, like when I started off, right, and this is back in 2011. So at that point in time, I was heading product at Coupon Dunia, which was a very very early stage online couponing company. And I was the fourth employee back there, right? I think the number one thing I realized the importance of there was building a fantastic culture, right? And obviously we've all read the books, we've all read how important culture really is, but you really understand what is the meaning of that when you're actually building something and when you actually experience amazing culture, right? So I think the number one takeaway from that adventure was the cultural aspects. I think little bit on Pharmeasy, right? So Pharmeasy, I think my biggest takeaway over there essentially was two things, right? One is how important really team chemistry is. And we had a very very big unfair advantage there, because when I started Pharmeasy as obviously one of the co-founders, pretty much when I was the employee number 4 at Pharmeasy, right? At Coupon Dunia, I'm sorry. And employee number 5, 6, 7, and 8 basically joined us straight at ground zero level at Pharmeasy, right? And that really held us in very good stead, because the chemistry was just so good in many ways. I keep saying this, that it was almost like being in the same company but just working on a different project. So a lot of things were unspoken, and that's what really led to us accelerating so quickly, because chemistry was so good. Everybody knew what the other person's strengths and weaknesses are and how to kind of work with each other. And I think another very important kind of thing that was cultivated in me during that time was this whole philosophy of how do you test a lot of things before you actually build out the entire product and automation when it comes to tech, right? Just to give some examples, as an example, when we started out Pharmeasy, right? The first app that we started out Pharmeasy with was literally like a one-page app, which only had 2 pages, right? Only had two things on it actually. One was uh, the headline which said that, what, we will deliver medicines to your place at 20% discount, a camera button, and another input point for taking the phone number of the customer, right?
Right.
That's it. We didn't take the address, we didn't take the name, no other detail, right? And really the logic there was essentially a couple of things. One is, in our big thesis was that customers don't really know the names of the medicines, right, when they're ordering. And B, we wanted it to be an extremely lightweight app, because we wanted it to launch literally the next day. That we were discussing all of these things. We just wanted to have something out there to test our thesis. So we didn't want to waste our time building like a huge e-commerce adventure, right, or a entire thing. So we built something really really tiny, threw it out there, and saw basically what the market had to say. And within a month, we had so much validation, and we realized that people are actually ordering medicines which are, chronic in nature, like things like, if you have diabetes and high blood pressure, the kind of medicines you order every month, that became our target audience, rather than, people having fever and cough and cold, because, that's more infrequent and not something which we realize that people want to order, and wait for maybe a day or so to get your medicines, right? If you have cold fever, maybe you just order medicines and want it instantly, right? And maybe you'll order from a local chemist. So it
Right.
became, the focus really became, how do we kind of target the chronic users? And of course, pretty much after that, right, Pharmeasy's number one focus became how do we kind of solve for that segment of users primarily, right, which was your chronic users. And I remember, like, we had a very, very interesting thesis in our board meetings at Pharmeasy, right? And actually, the biggest question we used to, get grilled on, by some really smart investors that we had were, basically, what's your repeat user base month on month, right? Because the reality was, unfortunately, if a customer has high blood pressure or diabetes, uh, this is going to be this is going to be a disease which is going to be with them for a long period of time. And, so the only reason he stops using you is because he thinks your service is bad, because he's definitely continuing to buy the medicines, right? So it was a very interesting, thesis, but, we really focused on repeat users on a month-to-month basis, and, we used to try and target almost like a 70 to 80% repeat user base, at that point in time, and that became really the number one KPI of the company, right?
Yep.
I think finally with Hotstar, right, I think the biggest and most important takeaway there was, I would say, two broad things, right? Or I would say three things. Number one, like, Hotstar was a very, very different animal, right? It was like a monster company even when I got in, because surprisingly, now that you think about it, when I got in, we had 7 million monthly active users. And, back then, 7 million was a good number,
Yeah.
right? It felt like, especially coming from the startup world, it felt like a, decent scale. And, that's what actually attracted me to them in many ways, right? Because otherwise I was like, this corporate life is going to be very, very difficult to get used to, especially a guy who's been primarily in very, very early stage companies, right?
Right. Right.
uh, but of course, they completely gave me the freedom, and of course, spent a lot of time convincing me that, you could bring in the same culture, vibe, all of those things, right? Build your dream team here. So when I came in at Hotstar, right, we went from 7 million, monthly active users to, I think, in a matter of 2 years, to about 300 to 350 million monthly actives, which basically, just to give context, basically meant that almost 70 to 80% of the people who had smartphones in India had a Hotstar app installed,
Right.
right? It just became omnipresent, right? So the kind of the most important thing for us, when we were at Hotstar, was that when you're in a very, very large company and there are so many people, right? And as the company grew, like, we almost end up being 200 people in just product and technology and, design. Um, what we kind of did, right? And, me being basically the guy who was leading growth and product, was we made the whole company kind of focus on one single KPI, right? So that that brought about a very singular focus in the company, because one of the things I noticed when I got in was that, different teams had different agendas, and that was like pulling the whole company, in very different directions, right? And when there is no clear KPIs given out, it's very difficult to grow something in a sustainable manner, or it's very difficult for anybody to be able to focus everybody in the right direction. So one of the number one things I I did when we were, scaling that large company, was that made sure that the entire team, everybody, right, in the company, knew what is that single KPI that we were choosing to optimize for, right? And maybe that KPI used to be sometimes, the number of premium subscribers. Sometimes it used to be, the watch time per user per day. Whatever that KPI is, right? We wanted to shout and scream that to everybody, so that whenever we got requests from a lot of teams, right, that, we would like to build this, we would like to offer this feature, uh, everybody knew that what are the chances of their request getting accepted basis this metric,
Right.
right? Because, once you do that, everybody in the company was very, very clear that they would not even come up to you unless they had an idea which would move this number, right? And And this number basically was consistent at least for a matter of, say, a quarter, or whatever duration you decide, right? But during that duration, the entire company pulled behind that one metric, right?
Okay.
And that was so important, right? To pull us all in the right direction, because we faced a lot of challenges at Hotstar, right? Obviously, from a technology perspective, we were dealing with scale, which is even now not dealt with in any kind of Indian technology company, right? Like, I don't know a single Indian technology company which is dealing with, say, 300, 350 million users hitting its servers every month, right? That's a very large number. So focus and limited amount of things that you're doing, but you have to do it really well to handle that kind of scale and stability was very important, right? I think another big important takeaway from Hotstar was, you know, uh, in a startup, as an example, you can do a lot of things yourself, right?
Right.
As an example, because you're the entrepreneur and you can just power through a lot of things, and it can be a very entrepreneur driven approach where you can handle many different divisions on your own. Maybe you can even lead the tech team, you can even lead the product team, you can even do a bit of business, you can do many things on your own, right?
Mhm.
But obviously in a setup like Hotstar, that wasn't possible. So one of the most important things that we set up over there, and I was instrumental in, really, is setting up a top down approach there by hiring you know uh, amazing leaders, to basically take on their responsibilities and do it amazingly well, right? So as an example, we literally went about, and one of my first things that I did at Hotstar, this is within the first 3 4 months, is basically really end up hiring the engineering lead, to say the machine learning lead, to the data engineering lead, right? And even the HR lead over there, right? From an engineering standpoint, because once you have the leads in place, right, then it's their responsibility to really run with the ball and do it well, right? So in fact, like, I had a running joke in Hotstar, right, like, where I used to keep saying, telling Akash, basically, who's now the CTO at Hotstar, and one of the best CTOs I had the fortune of working with, um, that before he joined, engineering used to be something that I used to worry about, right? But after he joined, I slept very peacefully at night, because I knew basically now that's his worry, right? So truly, in a very large scale, and I guess in a monster company like Hotstar, right? I think it is very important to have a very solid top down approach, where you have fantastic leaders in place, which can do their job really well, so that you can focus on certain other important things which require immediate attention, as an example, right? So I think a lot of these learnings, as an example, were important from every single stage, and of course I take them with me when I'm building Apollo Finvest today.
Right, right. Perfect. I mean, I do have a couple of follow-on questions to that. One is, you really initially highlighted that the team chemistry is so important in the culture, right? And at Hotstar also, sort of like, you built like the dream team, and you put in like the best leads. But when you are sort of like evaluating that in this scenario, like, what kind of people or skill sets I need in these different sort of verticals or departments, um, any sort of like tips or idea around that, like, how do you sort of engineer that skill set or team skill set, or sort of talent in a way, right? Like, how do you engineer it when you're forming it? Any tips around that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, few things which have worked really well for me, as an example, right?
uh,
So one, as an example, is I really look, when you're an early stage company, right, and you're, say, going towards, you're going towards scale, right? There are certain people, right? Like, as an example, there are certain people who solve certain problems really well, depending on the stage the company is in, right? So as an example, there are certain team members I've worked with who are fantastic when it comes to 0 to 1 problems, right? Because
mhm.
that's where you read really entrepreneurial spirit, and it's an ambiguous problem, and you need to basically be very agile, right? So the skill set required there is very different, but maybe taking something say from 1 to 100, right? That's a very different skill set, right? Because that's more to do with discipline, that's more to do with structure, that's more to do with stability, right? Because the problem isn't as ambiguous, at that point in time, right? So as an example, a lot of the people essentially that we ended up, hiring maybe at Hotstar were more the 1 to 100 kind of people, right? Because, many ways the platform was there in the sense of like, the product market fit was there, customers loved us, we were scaling, everything was going great. So the kind of people we needed to come on board were people who could add stability, structure, and almost like in many ways, at least from an engineering standpoint, we needed people to almost run a well-oiled, military operation in many ways, right?
Right, right.
It had to be like almost like a highly dependable factory,
Okay.
right, where everything is working perfectly. Because at that kind of scale, you do the last thing you want is systems breaking down, as an example, right?
Okay.
Or even when you conduct experiments, you have to do it with limited blast zones, so that if anything goes wrong, the radius is limited, because of course you can always do experiments, right? But it's very important to do experiments with limited blast zones, right?
Okay.
So that it's not basically an experiment which is taking over your entire audience and hurting everybody. uh, Another very important thing when it comes to hiring is I'm a big kind of believer in, a hiring, really focused on making sure that you hire uh, people from a very, very, you make sure you're culturally, there's a big connect, right? When you hire people, because, honestly, just for your own self, like you're going to be spending pretty much 70% of your, the time that you're awake during the day with them and working with them very, very closely, right? So you want to make sure you end up working with amazing people, right? Because any other way, it's going to lead to a suboptimal experience for both of you guys. And I think another very important factor of hiring is basically, that if you hire A plus players, they tend to attract other A plus players, right? So and if you hire B players, they attract C players, and C players attract D players, and it just basically you're surrounded by a suboptimal team, right? Which you end up hating. So overall, the way to basically maintain that high quality is that there are two ways to solve this problem, right? One way in which I have really tried to solve this problem personally is I either go back to people who I've already worked with, right? So I know the best guys I've worked with. Every time I do a company, or every time I was at Hotstar as an example, I went into my network and leveraged that, right, as an example, and literally got my dream team together. And a lot of them, as an example, I had not worked with before, right? But I got a lot of people from Coupon Dunia, I got a lot of people from Pharmeasy to work with me, at Hotstar. And the same point in time, I took advantage of my own network and people who I trusted, and other entrepreneurs who said that, what, I worked with, as an example, this person, and he was phenomenal, right? And I really believe in the power of basically, you know, transferring basically my trust, right? So as an example, if I think, you're an amazing person and I would love to work with you, right? But maybe you're doing your own company, so it's unlikely that I'll be able to get you on my team. But you believe that somebody else was there, who you worked with was, A plus. I would really sort of go out of my way to make sure that I, at least end up talking to this one candidate that you're really referring. So I really believe basically in the power of referrals amongst your own network, right? uh, and this is very, very important, especially in the early days of setting up your key team, or setting up your early team in a startup, or setting up your leadership team in a corporate, right? Because those are hires you need to basically make sure that you hit it out of the park, right? Because it's, as an example, it just takes 4 or 5 key hires, right? That you need to kind of get absolutely bang on right. Because once you do that, then they follow the same mentality and philosophy to hire the team under them, right?
Right.
uh, and then it works very, very beautifully, right? So I think all entrepreneurs, right, whoever it is, whether it's a corporate actually, or whether it's an entrepreneur, an early stage company, both of them should focus a lot on getting and making sure that the first few hires that you make, like for a startup, I think the most important hires are the first 10, 20 people that you hire, because that's really sets the tone of the company. and sets the culture, and they're going to be ending up hiring the next 100 people that you end up hiring. Or in a corporate, as an example, you want to make sure that the leadership team is A plus, because once they are A plus, you are sorted, because they will make sure that they will basically go ahead and end up hiring the best people under them, and make sure the culture that you want permeates across the company.
Right. Perfect. Thank you so much. I think, I mean, that's extremely insightful and very important. I guess, especially in our context, it'll be those early 10 to 20 hires, or maybe even like first 5 or 10, right?
Yeah.
Now shifting gears a little bit, I mean, I know we have covered like the whole product angle, but because you have done it so many times and in such different spheres, if you were to, let's say, tackle a new space, I don't know, maybe like an ed tech or space tech, I'm just giving an example. You can pick up something else.
Yeah.
How would you sort of approach it? Maybe like a short like framework or something. If you were to again approach it, start again.
Oh yeah. I mean, like, I think fundamentally, I think one of the things I really focus on is, I feel like when it comes to entrepreneurship, I think you should hold ideas very loosely in general. I think especially when you're starting out, I think to me, very honestly, the first 6 months are, I would just say, experimentation, right, of any company. Like, I think you should go in with a very, very open and fluid mind, really, right? Because the reality is, the first 6 months of you, what you're doing in a company, right, and sometimes even longer, is honestly, like, I always call it the time that you do PhD in the space that you're interested in, right? As an example, suppose you are interested in ed tech, right? I think the first 6 months should be just trying to understand what's going on in the market, what are the existing solutions out there, and do the following two things, right? I would say, one is, rather than holding your idea very, very closely inside you as a secret, right, actually, go and talk to existing edtech founders,
Mm-hmm.
right, who are ready to talk to you,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because when you talk to them, right, by default, founders will give you their 2 cents about what's working for them, and what they've seen in the past maybe doesn't work well,
Mm-hmm.
right? So this is, in a way, like, learning from people who've been there and done that, right? So take
Mm-hmm.
advantage of this experience, right? So
Right.
the number one thing I would suggest is, any space that you're interested in, right, go and talk to people who are in this space already and building a company in this space. And it doesn't have to be a very similar company to you, right? Just look for that. If they're in that space, just go and talk to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Once you do that, you'll be able to understand from them, what were things which work for them, what are things which are not working from them. Just learn from those experiences, and don't go with any preset, predetermined mindset, right? That's number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two is, once you do all of these things, right, you come up with some kind of thesis of about what is it that you want to build. Because after talking to so many people, that you realize that this is one true problem which exists, where there is demand also, but at the same point in time, there is no optimal solution which is out there, which solves this problem to the extent that you feel you can, right? And when you do this, right, it's very important, before you get into any space, right, to ask yourself this question. uh, what do I bring to the table, in the sense, why do I have an unfair advantage,
Mm-hmm.
right? So this is a question which is very, very pertinent when you're doing an early stage company, that what is your unfair advantage in this space,
Mm-hmm.
right? Why are you best positioned to solve it? So as an example, right, like, you may have an idea, or a guy may have an idea of how to build the best car, right? Or may have an idea how to, what is the best car they would want, right? But suppose they have no background in creating cars, or they don't have an existing ecosystem or sub unfair advantage to start building cars really, quickly, or they don't know an existing factory or on anything like that, right? I think you're starting at a very, very disadvantaged point, right? So
Absolutely.
the right way to do it, ask yourself, what is the unfair advantage I have to attack this space? Once you know that unfair advantage that you can, think of to attack this space, then you can come up with a solution knowing that, okay, when I build this kind of solution, I do have some kind of unfair advantage when I, think of some solution in this specific space,
Mhm.
right? Then what do you do is that, whenever you come up with a solution, typically what at least I recommend is that, don't spend a lot of money and time in kind of over engineering the solution, right?
Mhm.
Almost if possible, right? I'm a big believer in this no code philosophy, that when you typically start off, try and do it with as little engineering or automation as possible, right? Like, luckily we are in India where, time is not as expensive, when it comes to hiring a team or, setting up people, rather than a place like US as an example, where, the cost per hour of an employee is very, very expensive, right? So throw humans at the problem initially, because the goal should be that, just get something out there. It doesn't have to be the most fanciest thing. It doesn't have to be completely automated. So initially, like, follow a philosophy of, basically, do things that don't scale, right? Almost, right? Where if you are able to demonstrate and, get a product out there or get anything out there, which you can put in front of the, an audience that you have in your mind, a target audience, that's all you need.
Right.
And once you get it to them, right, in whatever condition which you have the product in, then, it's all about basically laser focusing on how the customer is using your product, right? So this is where, it's very, very important to understand the life cycle of the customer,
Right.
right? And what I mean by this is basically, don't just obsess about how the customer is using your product, right? Try and understand their true life cycle, right? So I'll give you an example of what I mean. So like at Pharmeasy, right? Um, Although like our main goal with them was, okay, like you need to order medicines, right? Like that was the goal. But
Right.
we were not obsessed with that, right? Because we try to understand the entire life cycle, like what happens before he needs to order medicines, what happens after he orders the medicines and they get delivered, right? So as an example, we understood that, prior to ordering the medicines, you know they have a prescription. Prior to having a prescription, they probably go to the doctor and get a prescription, right?
Right.
Prior to going to the doctor, they have symptoms, right? Once they've ordered the medicines and they are delivered, they need to get reminded or for eating these medicines on time. Once the medicines get over, they need to be reminded again to place the order again, right? So they need to be reminded when the medicines are expiring. They need to be reminded or told maybe that there are, cheaper medicines to the ones that they're, ordering right now, right? So there are so many of these hidden use cases, right, which can only be appreciated when you really understand the use case of the customer end to end, right? Because once you understand their entire life cycle, right, then you can and obviously you need to start with some position, so that's where your rough product initially is. But don't hold that use case very close to you, right? Be very open that, once you understand the life cycle of the customer, try and see where can you add the most value to them, right? And initially pick up that one area, right? And when you throw your product in front of your customers, right, you'll realize that certain kind of customers absolutely don't like it. Certain kind of customers will really appreciate it. And usually when you build a product, at least I always recommend, build a polarizing product which has a clear TG, right? As an example, like, don't build a product which is a jack of all trades and everybody has some use case for it, right? Because it's kind of messed up to not know your power user, right? So I always tell users, tell startups as a general, right, understand what is your power user, right? And have a product which is polarizing, right? Like, certain people should just be like, yeah, this is no use for me. But certain people should feel like, oh my god, like, you've solved a huge problem for me, right? I really care about this product. And this polarizing effect is amazing, because this helps you identify very clearly, that A, you have solved a real problem, B, you immediately know who the TG is, right? So what you can do, right? Because after this, right, once you understood product market fit for a certain TG, the next thing you're supposed to do is expand that TG and see, what is the TAM, right? Which is, what is the target audience, maximum target audience, and understand the potential of how big the service could be, right? And then you kind of can make a decision whether, the target audience is large enough or not. If it's not large enough, you can always pivot to another idea which is in the similar, once you identified the life cycle, you can keep moving, either behind or either in the front, adjust your product, right, to be in the life cycle in such a way that you end up being in a position where the target audience is large enough, and that target audience really loves your product. And once you've understood the target audience and one that is large enough, the next thing to be done is basically growth, right? And growth is basically nothing but figuring out who your power customer is, right? And this is for the initial days. Figure out who your target customer is initially, right? In a sense, who's your power customer? Who are the, what does the audience look like who uses your product in the top 20% of power users, right?
Right.
Once you understand that, then you kind of spend all of your time and energy in trying to get your product in front of this power user set and similar people to them, right? So it's almost like finding similar users to your power users, right? And once you do that, right, it's very powerful, because ultimately you're attracting more and more power users. And ultimately the biggest thing about power users is the fact that they don't have a reaction to your product, right? They love it. And once they love it, usually the lifetime value of those customers is very, very high. And initially, right, it's very, very important to control the growth of your product to specifically power users, right?
Right.
So that you don't have users who are using it, say, once in a while. You have people who love, and have deep feelings towards your product, right? Because ultimately, remember one thing, as a startup, right, you don't have many resources.
Right.
You probably, you can't solve generic problems really well, because large companies have already done that, right? And they have some generic solution out there. You are attacking a very specific point and a pain point and starting from there,
Right.
right? And once you've created like a mini cult in many ways, right, which loves the exact use case that you solved, and you've grown that user base to a certain extent, you know and once you've tapped out the TAM, right, to a certain extent, that is when you can then think about, how do I expand the TAM, right? And how do you expand the TAM is in the following ways. First, right, in the product, wherever is the whatever use case you solve it deeper, right? So solve it end to end, like go deep. And once you feel you've gotten deep enough, that's when you go wide, right? Because when you go wide, your TAM increases, plus your existing users start doing even other things on your product, because they have that brand loyalty, they love using it. And if you add additional things to it, as an example, they'll by default gravitate their their actions which they were taking maybe on other products to your product, just because they have they really feel that loyalty and they love using the product for something else. And by default, they'll expand the use case to maybe another action also, which you've incorporated in the product itself, right? So basically, in short, when it comes to a product, right, first you go really, really deep. Once you've gotten deep enough, then you go wide, right? And if you typically end up following this thesis, right, you will always end up with a product which which customers end up liking, right? All you have to do is make sure that in your entire journey, the TAM is big enough, so that you don't spend your time over optimizing for a particular problem and a solution which in the end of the day just doesn't have a large enough target audience, right? That's one thing you have to be wary of.
Right. Absolutely. That has given a lot to me also to think about, even in terms of Sparklehood. Uh, thank you so much. So like a lot of things that you said, like in your journey, it seems very visible that you've actually like practiced these things. These are not just like advices or things you've read somewhere. Like even for example, Pharmeasy, right? Like you just like went out with the MVP. You were not attached to the idea. You held it very loosely. The market sort of told you that like, okay, like these chronic diseases or sort of like the repeat purchases is where I need to focus. And that happened after the MVP. But before you sort of like got that insight, you said that you now it's kind of clear that you want to see that the TAM is really big before you get into something, at least. So that at least if you build something really deep, then it kind of makes sense that okay, like big enough market. So how did you assess sort of like that opportunity for Farm Easy after Coupon Dunya, and how do you do that at a personal level, or was there some other insight, any pattern in the market?
Sure. I mean, see, fundamentally, I'll tell you, like, I mean, very honestly, choosing a space, right? is something I would suggest that it has to be, there has to be some point where um, you feel the space is big enough, intuitively, right? As an example, right? I mean, fortunately in India, I would say that choosing a market is not very difficult from the size of the opportunity perspective, because I mean, I yet feel um, from a technology perspective, we are very very shallow today, right? Like, I mean, uh, I think we are decades away from being a space which is overcrowded with tech solutions, right?
Right.
So I think that's not really the big challenge. The big challenge always is what's the unfair advantage you can bring to that space to be able to compete with the inevitable competition, basically, right? So in Pharmeasy, as an example, we had a little bit of an unfair advantage because one of my roommates at at Carnegie Mellon, right, where I graduated with my masters,
Right.
he was running one of the largest pharma distribution companies in Maharashtra, right, at that point in time.
Right.
So we got a lot of insights about how do we kind of think about this space totally vertically integrated, right? So as an example, one of the biggest feats of Pharmeasy was not really the consumer facing app or the delivery and all of these things, right? I think, of course, to the end customer, that's what they see. They see the consumer facing app and they see the on time deliveries. Of course, that was pretty great. And, honestly, that really came from the DNA of us being very, very customer centric in general.
Right.
Like, that was the reason why we were able to build all of those things amazingly. But actually, the secret sauce of the company in many ways came from our obsession about supply chain,
Right.
right? Where we went deep into that problem of actually integrating, with integrating the supply chain for and the inventory management for the local pharmacies that we did tie-ups with, and connecting them with the distributors, right? And I remember in those Pharmeasy days, like, I think traditionally when your pharmacist used to place an order from distributors, the order used to get delivered to them for their inventory in 6 to 7 working days, right? And
Mhm.
with Pharmeasy, basically with that level of technology integration, and with the support of the right distributors at the back end who wanted to be jumping on this new space and be technology savvy, right? We had reduced that to a matter of hours, right? Which was a huge thing to do in an industry which is quite orthodox, right? It's not a space, as an example, where everybody's looking and champing on the bit to take on technology, right? So a
Right.
lot of those things became in a way our unfair advantage, and even today, as an example, that's why Pharmeasy is and yet remains the guy to basically compete with when it comes to this, obviously, this vertical integration. And I think that space is going to be super interesting now that Amazon's, Flipkart, Geos of the world, everybody wants to go after this space. And it's not a surprise, because ultimately chronic illness is a huge market, unfortunately, in India, right? And it's something which I think by default everybody needs to work towards to be able to manage. But I would say that in that space, there are so many problems to solve, right? I mean, Pharmeasy, of course, is looking at only the piece of, delivering medicines, right? But, you can even build an app, as an example, or a digital solution to manage chronic illnesses as well. As an example, if you have diabetes, right, you can even help the customer think about what he should be eating, how much exercise he should be doing, monitoring their diabetes, right? All of that in one singular app. If you build something like that, it's incredibly valuable as a journey, as a companion app, right, to the kind of chronic illness that you have. And I think these solutions are either not there, as far as I'm concerned, or even if there are existing solutions, nobody's really been able to build a world class solution, right? And fortunately, these problems are global problems.
Right.
So I think in general, when you're thinking about a space, right, I think spaces are pretty large in general, like in India, right? Um, but I think what you should really think to yourself is, what from my maybe existing networks that that people I have access to, or from my own professional or personal experiences that I've had over the last 20-30 years, that you've been basically born, can you dive deep into to be able to bring something unique to the table to solve a particular problem in the best way possible.
I think that kind of covers that, where also at Sparklehood we are kind of looking for people who bring in some kind of unfair advantage. And I think couple of things you mentioned, either it could be like your industry connect, or sort of like the domain or space you understand very well, or you possess a skill set which can help you build the product much better than anyone else, right? This obviously helps you sort of like kickstart the journey very well. That was kind of like the last question, but I think we have already covered that. So thank you so much for taking out the time, and this was absolutely brilliant and very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure chatting.